You're a passenger on an airliner, and you see on the window how the aircraft gets closer to the ground quite smoothly until you see the actual runway, and what happens afterwards is a slight shock, and you realize that the landing gear has touched the ground and you're slowing down relatively quickly. How do pilots know how to do that? As well as to do that really well and almost perfectly. Thus, learning how to land an airliner also applied to learning how to land a small Cessna. Let's find out the key principles to land an aircraft, as well as what makes a good landing, and how to execute it properly. First thing you have to know is that the approach, which is the stage on the flight before the landing, it is very, very important. More important than you think. If your approach is bad, your landing 99% of the cases it will be bad. And if your approach is good, well, the landing, it depends obviously, and 90% of the cases are good. I mean, there are certain, there are certain differences, but we'll get into that later. And in order to execute a good approach, which is what we're going to get into, you have to know about two important things. The first one is the airspeed. I just cannot overemphasize how important this magnitude is, because it is the fundamental magnitude of aviation, which is what basically makes aircraft fly. If there's no airspeed, there's no flight, at least in airplanes. But if you ignore airspeed, if you're too fast, then you'll take a considerable amount of time in order to slow down, which is only achievable. You only have to achieve that in order to achieve a landing. And if you're too slow, you lose a lot of energy. And that energy is what you need in order to make the landing. Because if not, you'll most likely end up in a stall. But not most likely, but you basically just want to avoid that. And there are at a certain point, you're going to have to slow down too much that it is beyond the aircraft capabilities, unless if you put drag and lift at the same time. And that is what the flaps do. The flaps are the things at the back that move against the current of the air in order to increase drag and increase lift. And that is for landings and sometimes takeoffs. Most of it depends on aircraft, but most of the time is landings, because you need drag and lift at the same time in order to achieve that airspeed you need to land. More complex aircraft use landing gear, but that is more complex aircraft. But landing gear is also uses a lot of drag, which is really important. And then the second principle for any landing is the runway alignment. You have to know that in aviation, there are 3 dimensions, not just 2, like when you're driving your car. It is 3 dimensions, and it is not just aligning your aircraft horizontally to the runway. You're also aligning it vertically to the runway. Now, most runways have a 3-degree glide path, which you need to follow in order from the pre-selected altitude you set to the actual touchdown. It is a 3-degree glide path, and it is very standard, but we'll get into that into another video. What you basically have to know is that you have to center your aircraft to the runway center line as close as possible as you can. I cannot overemphasize, because if you're too far, even if you think that you're going to correct that at the last moment, it is going to be really difficult, because you have to know that the approach, it is really important. And if you're too far from the center line, you'll most likely end up in a runway excursion at the worst case scenario. And then there is also the glide path. The glide path is, it is a 3-degree glide path you need to follow for the touchdown. And basically, if you're too high, you're going to end up really fast, and you're going to have to lose a lot more energy than you think, which will result in a late touchdown, which will also risk a runway excursion. It is, yes, I know, it is very, not just complicated, but also risky, But the landing is one of the most important stages of the flight. And then if you're too low, it also complements with the airspeed thing. If you're too low, you'll most likely, you're gonna have to use a lot more energy in order to correct that. And if you don't use it carefully, you might end up in a stall, which is why you need to be at the correct glide path, 3 degrees. And there are exceptions in different airports, but most of the time it's 3 degrees. And there are also these things called PAPI lights, which are 4 lights located next to the runway, next to the touchdown zone, and they turn from red to white. If all 4 of them are red, it means you're too low, and if 4 of them are white, it means you're too high. And if there are 2 whites and 2 reds, it means you are on the right. Now, only once if you make a good approach, then we can talk about making a good landing. And it's actually simpler than you think. And there are just 3 basic aspects in order to make a good landing. The first thing is the runway centerline, which complements the runway alignment. And yes, the centerline is the horizontal guidance. And you have to basically be at the center line, not to the right, not to the left, at the center, not like in a car or in the street. Next is the touchdown zone. The touchdown zone, it is those big rectangles you see next to the a few thousand feet after the threshold. Those big rectangles is actually the touchdown zone, which is basically where you have to touch down in order to make a safe landing. If you pass the touchdown zone, you might gonna have to think about making a go around, which I'll get into that later, but it is really common if you're practicing. I mean, not common, but if you think that the landing is not going to be safe, you have to go around without hesitation, because you have to remember safety is the number 1 priority in aviation. And then the final thing is pretty basic, the smoothness. You have to make the landing as smooth as possible, which is actually what complements the flare, which I'll get into that right now. Now, aviation is a top priority in this channel, and if you have any questions of any sort about aviation, and let me know in the comment section so I can cover a video about it. And I just cannot overemphasize, because if you keep those questions, then you'll keep curiosity out of your mind. So I would highly encourage you to do so, and also to subscribe in order to not to miss any of those topics about aviation. I really appreciate if you do that. Now, in order to execute, because one thing is making a good landing, and another thing is making the execution of it. The execution is simple, but there could also be a little complicated, especially on practice. We'll get into that. And the execution is when you do the landing, obviously. And in order to make a good landing, you have to flare. A flare is basically slowing down the descent rates, as well as slowing down, the airspeed. The flare is basically losing all of that speed, both vertically and horizontally, in order to make a smooth touchdown and actually just make the aircraft touch down. It is a perfect balance between making the aircraft land and also making the aircraft not landing, because you have to make it smooth. And I mean, in not all cases you have to make it smooth. We'll get into that in another video, but yeah, you have to consider about the smoothness in order to make the passengers feel comfortable, and also not to damage the aircraft as much as possible. And during the flare, you have to look at the end of the runway. And because most of the time during the approach, you're going to look at the threshold of the runway, or the runway, the touchdown zone markers, in order to make the approach. But during the flare, which is you're right above the runway, you have to look at the end of the runway, because that gives you a very good perspective on how far above you're from the landing or the touchdown or from the ground. And yes, that is just pretty much it. But there is one very important thing to consider, and that is practice, muscle memory, as well as consistency, because landings are way harder than you think. If you think landings are easy, you're overestimating it, and if you think landings are really hard, you're underestimating it, obviously. But I think that didn't make any sense. But anyways, if you just keep practicing no matter what, it's not really a grind anyways, because you'll get used to it and you'll practice a lot. But if you think that you're really bad at landings, I believe in you. You will do them correctly and really well. You won't be the pilot's butter machine. I know how it feels coming from a 14-hour flight and making a bad landing. You're off the center line, off the touchdown zone, and you're just not happy, all because of the landing. Even after the 14-hour flight, I know you, and yes, all it takes is making a good landing in order to save the flight, and also save the day if you want to, make this a little more poetic. But anyways, yes, all you need is practice as much as possible, as well as discipline and consistency in order to make a good landing. Now that this is said, I hope you enjoyed, and if you liked it, I highly appreciate it if you liked the video, because if you actually like the video, then there's a way to demonstrate how to like the video by clicking a button. It is pretty obvious, I know, but I highly encourage you to do that, and it just takes a few seconds, but thank you if you do that. And don't forget to subscribe, and yes, I'll see you on the next flight. Happy flying.